Hello, and welcome back to the Care Collective, the podcast where we have honest conversations about caregiving, grief, identity, and everything that comes with caring for someone you love. I'm your host, Michaela, and whether you're currently a caregiver, were one in the past, or simply trying to navigate one of life's hardest seasons, I am so glad that you're here and that you're taking the time to take care of yourself today. My hope is that every episode reminds you of at least one thing that you matter to. So let's dive in. I know everyone has absolutely loved it whenever we talk about I think a feeling that nobody really talks about very much, and that is grief. And today I wanted to kind of explore another side of grief that I think I've never heard many conversations about. Not about losing someone you love or watching someone change because of an illness or aging, although that is very real, and we've definitely talked a lot about that on the podcast. But the grief of realizing that you've changed too. And maybe it's not all at once, maybe it happens slowly over time and almost without noticing. You had canceled plans, you had to deal with an emergency, and suddenly you quit doing the same things that you feel like made you you. Until one day you catch yourself looking at an old picture, remembering a hobby you haven't touched in years, or trying to find a answer to a simple question like, what do you do for fun? And you're like, what? When did I do something for fun recently, And you realize you don't really know yourself anymore. So today I want to talk about the grief of mourning the person you used to be, because I think it's one of the most common experiences that caregivers have and one of the least talked about. So I wanted to give it a name, talk about why it happens, and more importantly, talk about how you begin to find yourself again. When we hear the word grief, I think we usually think about death. But psychologists have known for decades that grief isn't limited to losing a person. We grieve lost futures, lost relationships, lost abilities, lost dreams, and sometimes we grieve lost identities. Research on family caregivers consistently shows that many experience what's called identity disruption or loss of self. As caregiving responsibilities grow, people often describe feeling like every other part of who they are slowly disappears. Instead of being a teacher, an artist, an entrepreneur, a runner, a musician, a friend, or spouse who also provides care, they begin to feel like they're only a caregiver. I know I've been through seasons of this in my life, and I think it even applies to situations outside of caregiving. Like maybe you give a lot of yourself to a job, and suddenly you don't know who you are outside of work anymore, right? Or you spent so much time in school being a good student, studying when you were in college, you graduate, and then you're like, oh, I'm just supposed to work now every single day. I don't study, I don't take tests anymore, right? Like, whenever you kind of go through these big experiences where you dedicate a lot of yourself, it's hard to not make that your identity. And if that gets taken away from you and that's no longer your identity, then you're truly in an identity crisis trying to figure out who you are anymore. And that's not, I mean, I guess there's probably a form of burnout happening there, right? But it really is an identity shift. And that identity loss is something that I think our brains naturally want to grieve because we're kind of trying to grasp for what's going on in our world, right? One researcher who has done a lot of work in this space is Pauline Boss. She developed the theory of ambiguous loss, which described losses that don't have a clear ending. Maybe someone is physically present but psychologically different because of dementia, brain injury, or mental illness, but I think ambiguous loss might also help explain something else. Your old life did not disappear overnight, there was no abrupt ending to it, it slowly faded. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to give up all of your hobbies and focus on this individual. You didn't decide overnight that you want to cut out your friends, no more vacations or spontaneous weekends. It just disappeared. One appointment at a time, one emergency at a time, one responsibility at a time, as you slowly started to do more and more and more for this person. So you didn't have time to grieve. No one brought casseroles because you stopped painting. No one sent flowers because you canceled another vacation. No one checked in because your entire identity slowly shifted. But this doesn't mean that the loss wasn't real. And if this sounds familiar, maybe you stopped introducing yourself by what you love. Instead, you introduce yourself by who you care for. Someone asks, "What did you do for fun?" and you genuinely don't know anymore. Maybe your calendar only contains appointments for someone else. Maybe you've become so good at surviving that you've forgotten how to actually live. Or maybe the hardest part is looking back at old pictures and feeling like you're looking at a stranger. If you've ever felt that way, you are not selfish. I think you're just going through a lot of grief. And I think this is where a lot of caregivers can get stuck because the next thought is usually, I shouldn't feel this way. They're the one that's sick. Why should I be feeling bad about the fact that I can't go paint on the weekends, right? But grief isn't a competition. You can desperately love someone and still mourn the life you've lost. Those two things do not cancel each other out. They can both be true. So, what do we do in this case? I don't think the goal is necessarily becoming who you were before caregiving, because honestly, I don't think that's possible. You've changed, you've seen things that most people haven't. You've learned compassion, advocacy, patience, resilience, and strength in ways that you maybe never wanted to, but it's still there. So the goal here shouldn't be to go backward, but to build a future where caregiving is part of your story, but not your entire identity either. So here's where I encourage you to start. First, I want you to name what you've lost. Not just the obvious things, but write down maybe the emotional things you feel like you've lost, like your confidence or your freedom, being able to be spontaneous. Maybe that was something you really prided yourself on before, just being a very easygoing person. And now you just feel that stress all the time, right? Maybe you had to give up hobbies or a career or friendships. I think naming what you have lost lets you start healing in that process, right? And second, I want you to remember what made you feel alive in the first place. Ask yourself one question. Before survival mode, what made me feel like me? Maybe it was photography, reading, travel, running, playing music, baking. Whatever it was, don't pressure yourself to fully return to it. Just start one small step at a time. Music was something in particular that I was very fond of when I was in high school. I've done chorus, band, I did strings for a little bit. If there was anything musical related, I was on top of it. But I got so burnt out through college, through just living life. And I've kind of just been feeling like myself in this season of wondering who I am anymore, what are my hobbies, and I found myself wanting to go back to music. And I already had people at church. I feel like it's a thing that when people find out you can play piano, they want you to play piano for everything. And immediately they were trying to say, like, hey, can you play for this performance and this performance and this one? And I was already overwhelmed to the point that I have basically just had to tell everyone, no, actually, forget that I play piano, because I kind of need space to get used to playing again. I want it to be for my enjoyment and to not feel the pressure that I felt, back when that was the whole reason why I quit in the first place, because it became my identity and I didn't feel like I was a person outside of it, right? I want to be seen for more than just the things that I can do, and I want it to be a hobby and not something that becomes stressful for me. So, as guilty as I felt saying no to people, it still feels so nice to know that this is something I can focus on for just myself and trying to regain that love of music so that I have a safe space to turn to when I'm stressed out with work or with taking care of people, right? That is something that I can turn to that is just for me and it's not for anyone else. So don't be afraid also if your hobby somehow involves other people to be selfish, make it about you. You like baking? Okay, then eat the whole pie by yourself if that's gonna make you feel better. Maybe don't do that every time, but what's to say you couldn't do that, one time if you just really feel like you need something to yourself? So please just start with a small step. For me, it felt too stressful to go and perform, so I'm just gonna start by trying to get back into playing piano, maybe once a week or so. Just something that I can do to relax. I'm not going to jump right into trying to perform a very complicated piece in front of a lot of people because it can feel difficult if you're trying to, get back into an old self and all the emotions that go with that. The third thing to focus on is to become more than one thing again. I think one of the biggest risks of caregiving is becoming consumed by a single role. So try finishing this sentence without mentioning caregiving. I am someone who fill in the blank there. You might discover parts of yourself that are still there. Funny, creative, curious, loyal, kind, driven, adventurous. Those things are still deep down inside of you. And I think, as you're discovering new hobbies, it's going to be so easy to hyperfixate on one thing. Like I said, I could have hyperfixated on music and done so much with that I burned myself out. But I think it's important to discover new hobbies. I've always been wanting to try doing stand-up comedy because I love joking and making people laugh. Maybe that's something I should go and try, and challenge myself a little bit, or I love spending time hiking and I like the idea of training my body so that I can do more difficult hikes. That's something that I really enjoy. My sister loves running. That's great for her. She can do marathons and all these other things. I would prefer to focus on, how can I make my body be stronger so that I can climb a mountain? That's something that's been very positive for me. So, filling your life with multiple aspects can really be very healing and can remind yourself that you're allowed to care for more than one thing. And finally, I want you to give yourself permission to become someone new. You don't have to be the old version of yourself. If you think that you've changed in good ways, please take the good parts with you. And I don't want you to necessarily just be the person that caregiving forced you to become. I want you to kind of focus on this new version of yourself, someone who carries both the grief and the hope, someone who has changed in good ways, but still remembers the things that makes them them. Whether it's the people in your life, it's the hobbies that you have, the work that you've been able to do. Because if you've been mourning the person you used to be, I hope that today gives you a language for something you've been feeling for a long time. Because I promise you are not broken. Grief does not mean that you have to be broken. Grief is just proof. I think one of my favorite definitions, especially in the sense of losing a loved one, is that it just shows how much you were capable of loving someone. And so I think grief for yourself is proof that you were capable of loving yourself and that you did love yourself. And now you've just gone through a difficult season where you've forgotten the things you love about yourself, right? And grief makes you feel really heavy and like you'll never feel whole again. But I truly believe that the person that you were is not gone forever. Some parts are just waiting to be rediscovered, and others are becoming even stronger than before. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Care Collective podcast. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love it if you shared it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. And if you're looking for a community that truly understands the caregiving journey, be sure to check the links in the show notes. Until next time, remember this, you deserve care too.